Okay, today the shear that we gave this morning didn't record, so I'm just going to quickly do a a daf for the YouTube channel. So we're picking up from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is holding on the bottom of Yubez and Midbez. The Mishnah says as follows: Machnes adam peiros mipnei haganav. The Mishnah is discussing the halacha of a davar oven on chalamayit. I'm allowed to bring my peiros in from the field. Vishola pishtana min hamishra, and I'm also allowed to take my flax that's in my soaking bucket. That's the way they would soften the flax to use it. It would be to soften it in water. I'm allowed to take it out from the bucket. Bishvil shalai toivet. In both of these scenarios over here, I'm allowed to do it because whether it's the peiros in the field for the ganovim, I'm allowed to do it to prevent it from being stolen, or it's the flax from the bucket in order so that it doesn't spoil or rot, because if it sits in the water too long, it's going to ruin the flax. It's a davra oven, and it's therefore going to be mutter on chalamayit. However, it's very important that this halacha of the heter of davra ovid, I can't plan to do the malacha from the outset on chalamayit. That's going to be usher. In fact, not only that, if it's usher, Zak the Mishnah v'chulan imkivna malachta b'mayit, if I went ahead and did it on purpose and scheduled the malacha to be done on chalamayit, when the option of doing it before chalamayit, Allah is yavedu, there's a knas, there's a fine that says that it's usher b'ana, I can't benefit from it. Brisa says, and the Gemara says as follows: Tana says in the Brisa, the halacha is that the din of the Mishnah of bringing the fruit in, the halacha is that you're allowed to bring it in as a davra of it, l'tzarech hamayid. It's not l'tzarech hamayid. Pasha says this is a davra of it. It says over here it's got to be done bitzina l'seich beisa, so that people shouldn't think if they see me walking b'reshus harabim that I'm allowed to do it even tircha shelo l'tzarech, and therefore in order to prevent that one should do it bitzina discreetly when they bring it into their house. Rav Yosef havelei kishuri. Rav Yosef had lumber in his forest, in his yard, or whatever it was. Eilino b'yamama, and he, seemingly in direct opposition to the din of the brisa, went ahead during the day and went ahead and brought all this stuff in, which seems that he was relying on the heter of the Mishnah, and yet he was doing it during the day, which would be a time when it was not being done discreetly. Our Mishnah, our brisa, it says so that it has to be brought in a discreet manner with discretion. So he answered him, no, not shver. Why? He says, these boards, these beams, the lumber, in order to bring them in, they needed to be done in order to do them discreetly. The most discreet way to do it is during the day. Yamamahu. Why? Because kivan the belelia, since by night, boy gabri yisayir, I'll need more people in order to help me bring it in. Uboy madbura denura, and I'll need people to hold all of the lights, meaning they'll have to hold the torches to be able to make sure that I can see. Av shemilsa, it's going to become more obvious. It's going to be more of a public fair public display at night. So therefore, ironically, during the daytime, when more people can see it, it's actually significantly more discreet, and therefore it's going to be mutter for me to do it then, and I'm being mekayim the din of the brayso. Continues the Gemara, it says in the Mishnah of Sherla Pishnov and Amishra, you're allowed to take the flax out of the pool of water in order to prevent them from going bad. And it said in the Mishnah that if you decided to plan doing the malacha on chalamayit, meaning you could have done it before, and instead you relied on the heter of the Mishnah and did it on chalamayit, in order to disincentivize people from doing that, we asked you from having any hana from the item that you worked with. So let's say in this case the fruit or the flax is also behana. Ask Rabbi Yirmiyah as follows. Boy minei Rabbi Yirmiyah Reb Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked of Reb Zera the following shaila: the din of our Mishnah, where if a person went ahead and chose to do it, kivan malachtai b'mayit, you went and did it on purpose on chalamayit, vimes, and now the person dies. So he himself would have been aser bahana. Do we say that his children are also going to be aser? Should they be penalized the same way that he would be? Or do we say that no, the penalization occurs only for him, but it does not apply to the children? Meaning the question we'll see in the Gemara in a moment is, do we say that the iser knas, the fine was put on the person, in which case and he's gone, or was the fine put on the item? If it was put on the item is still here, in which case then even the son should not be allowed to benefit from it. So the effective question Rabbi Yirmiyah was asking here, if he dies, do his sons also have the knas or not? And he says as follows. He says there are two places where you might want to find a potential comparison, where over there we might say that the sons are also usher, and he's going to suggest that in both of those scenarios, don't use those as a model for what the halacha should be over here. If you want to say that I can go to the following halacha, which is talking about karbanos of a bechar, which has a din kedusha, it has hegdish. The halacha is that it gets a mum. If it gets a blemish, it's now no longer going to be considered hegdish, but rather it automatically becomes mutter to eat as regular non-hegdish meat. So there's a concern that someone might go ahead and put a mum in the animal in order to be able to benefit from being able to have the meat. So therefore, in order to prevent somebody from doing that, they made a knas which said that it's aser b'hana. You're not allowed to have any benefit from the animal, even if it has a mum that someone did on purpose. So tsarim ozen b'char, if someone went ahead and intentionally cut the ear of an animal that is a carbon b'char, kansu b'no achrav. Not only do we say that the father is aser to eat from this carbon, but even if he dies, his sons are also aser. He says, and Zokter B'yirmiyah, don't bring me a raya from this case to my question, because maybe over here, the reason why over there we will take the tzad that it's going to be also for the son is mishum de isura deraisa, since the whole entire isur is an isur deraisa, which again, from here you see a shtukel raya to the shittas who hold that chalamayid is only an isur derabanan. Therefore, maybe by isur chalamayid, it's going to be a different halacha. Maybe it wouldn't apply to the son. And the second case, he says, don't bring me a raya from bimtim tzuleim machar abdel legoy the mace concept nayachrav. We're talking over here about the halacha that you're not allowed to sell an evet knaini to a guy. Why? Because an evet knaini is chayiv in mitzvahs like a woman, meaning he's chayiv in mitzvahs say completely, and mitzvahs say man grama he's chayiv. He's not chayiv in, but mitzvahs say man grama he is chayiv in. So you see, he's chayiv in mitzvahs. You're not allowed to sell him to a guy. Why are you not allowed to sell him to a guy? Because you have to make sure that he's going to continue performing all of his mitzvahs. And if you sell him to a guy, the halacha is you have to be paid to him. You have to redeem him. Not only that, you have to pay an exorbitant amount, up to 100 times the amount of the price of the slave. You have a chiyuv to be paid to him. Now, what's the halacha if the person sells shalai kedin an evet kanai to a guy where he has a din that he's got to buy him back, but before he buys him back, he dies? Does the son have a chiyuv to buy him back or not? Do we say that the knas follows the father to the son? So the halacha over there is not clear, but there's a tzad to say that we would say the son's also chayiv to redeem him. So Zakter B'yirmiyah, don't bring me a raya from that case. And maybe that if we say the same thing by the son over there, we should say the same thing by us over here. He says maybe the reason over there we're more machmir on the son is mishum dechol yoyim mafkilim mitzvahs, because every day that he doesn't buy the guy back, doesn't buy the evet knaini back from the guy, he's going to potentially be doing more and more averis. He's not going to be keeping mitzvahs, and therefore maybe they extended the knas even to the son. Masha ein came by chalamai that doesn't have that problem. He says hachamai. What do we say over here? Meaning he's now going to explain his question as I spoke it earlier. Gavra kanis rabbanon. Did the rabbis create the penalty, the knas, on the person himself, the person who did the act, meaning maybe it's as a punishment? The halasa, he's gone. He's no longer around to punish him. So therefore, the sons are going to be mutter. Of Dilma, no, we say memayna kanas rabbanon. They penalized the penalty here. The knas is more of a deterrent to prevent someone from doing such a thing. So therefore, what they did was they created the deterrent in the item itself and said this thing cannot be. No benefit may be derived from this thing, from the father or from even the children, in which case then even the kids are going to have an isser, the ha'isa, and this item is still around. So therefore the son should be usher in it. This is the suffix that Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Reb Zera. Reb Zera answered back. Tanisua, we taught it, it's a brisa, it's actually a mishnah in Shvius, Sadash Niskavtza b'Shvius. If you have a field that has a lot of thorns. Now removing thorns is not really considered a complete malacha. It's sort of just like you're cleaning the area. So we wouldn't say that if you've been Niskavtza b'Shvius, that you've done malacha in the karka. Einachanami, it's aser. You're not supposed to do it, but if you did it, we don't consider that malacha, and therefore, because of that, tizara lemotah shvius, we don't create a penalty. There is no knas that if you did that, you're not allowed to then use that land after shvius. We don't say that what you're using is deriving benefit from the work that was done during shvius. Whereas netaiva or nedaira, different forms of fertilizing land, which is absolutely 100% working the karka. Now, granted, although it is usher, it's not working the karka minatayra. Minatayra shvius is only usher for those malachas that were the avos malachas, as we learned earlier. But the toldos, which this would be one of the toldos of pashtus, it's a tolda of plowing. You're basically making the ground more fertile for it to be able to take crops. That is going to be also with the rabbanon. And over here, if you did such a thing and you worked the land in that way, like Sisra Lamatzah Shvius, you're not allowed to plant after Shvius because this is called benefiting from the work that you did during Shvius. And the understanding is that this is a knas that Chazal set up. So this is a knas. So Reb Zera is trying to answer this question from this case. Now the halacha is that this knas, that you're not allowed to use the land of Shvius, the land that you work during Shvius by fertilizing it. And then Aktinan, we taught a tiva, that if you did such a thing, v'meis, and the person who did it died, where he who has a knas and he can't work the land afterwards, it says over here, b'nai zaira, that his children are allowed to plant and they're allowed to use the field despite the fact that Malacha was done with it. Midrabanan, Alma, what do you see? The day Rabbanan, that the Knas is only made in the person, Livrei, for his children after he dies, like Rabbanan, it's going to be mutter. So then, so to Achanami, we'll say B'chalamai, the day, the person who brought the fruit in, or the person who went ahead and scheduled his flax removal on Chalamayit, Kanser Rabbanan, only he had the knas that it's Asr Ba'ana, the brave, but for his son, it's not going to be Asr Ba'ana. The Gemara continues on Rabbaye, Naktina, we also learned Time Tarosa. This is talking about the halacha that whenever you're talking about damaging someone with something that is a hezek she'enai nikr, meaning I damage you, that you now no longer have something, but the damage is not a physical damage, it's a spiritual damage. So let's say you have taharas, you're a kohen, you have truma, you can't eat the truma if it's tameh. I went ahead and I take a sheretz and I drop it on your truma, now the truma is going to be tameh, you're not allowed to eat it. So I've damaged you, you now no longer have this truma. So the halacha is that meikar hadin, although I have damaged you, you can't be motzi mammon for me because this is called a hezek she'enai nikr, and hezek she'enai nikr is lav shmei hezek. I don't have a chiyuv to pay you, meets meikar hadin as a tashlumin, as a recompense for what I did. However, the rabbis understood that in order to prevent people from going around and being metame people's taharas, they made a knas, they made a penalty that says that if you actually did this, you are chayav to pay for the damage. So therefore, Amar Abaye Naktina and Timei Taros of a mace. What happens if a person went ahead and did this thing, was matame someone's taharos, and he died, and now his son, he didn't have a chance to pay him back. Does the son have a chiyuv to pay him? So like concept it says over there that we learned that there's no knas afterwards, my time, but what's the reason? Hezek she'enai nikr l'shmei hezek, like I explained, it's not considered a real damage that mikra, then you're chayav to pay. Rather, it's just a knas, and therefore l'didei kanser rabbanan, the knas only went to him. Livrei like kanser rabbanan, really no different here than the case that we just saw above by shvius, and therefore so to b'chalamayit. Continues the Gemara, a new Mishnah. You're not allowed to buy homes, avodim, slaves, behemoths, animals, they only had to buy these things on chalamayit is if you need them for chalamayit, meaning if they're not a tzarech hamayit, if they're not needed for usage on chalamayit, then this type of purchase is going to be aser, and the reason it's going to be aser is because there's no tzarech, it's a malacha, shalom tzarech, and that's going to be aser. There's a discussion in the Rishon over here about whether this din is limited to these three items, or are we saying this is true for anything, that you can't buy anything on Chalamayid, ayin and Mishpura for the Psak Halacha, but the two shittas in the Rishonim are, do we say that Tzorach HaMoed is only needed by these three things because they're done before Hesia, or do we say no, that even things that are done b'tzina require a Tzorach HaMoed? The Mishnah on my base is mashman like that. Oh, the Tzorach HaMocher, another heter to buy these items from the mocher, even if it's not l'tzorach hamoed, even if you don't need these things l'tzorach hamoed, but rather there's another reason why you're allowed to buy it, or l'tzorach hamocher, meaning what? Meaning she'ein lo ma'yochel. What if you have a mocher who doesn't have enough food to eat? So you're doing a mechesed, you're buying his products today, meaning really you could wait till after cholamayit because you don't need it for cholamayit. But by buying it today, you're going to provide him with some profit that'll be able to use that to buy food for Yontiv, buy food for cholamayit, and therefore that's going to be mutter, but only when he's someone who's ein loy ma'yochel. But if he has what to eat, then the halacha is you're not allowed to do it. That's the Mishnah. Zok the Gemara. Rava asked the following kasha. It says in the Mishnah that I'm allowed to buy something from someone if he is someone who has nothing to eat. But is that also true that I'm not only allowed to buy something from someone, can I hire someone to work for me if he's someone who has nothing to eat? Meaning, do we say the same argument that he needs money, so therefore let me hire him? Am I allowed to do that? Meaning, I don't want to just give him stuff. Am I allowed to benefit from his work? And I can make the argument that since I'm paying him and he now has something to use to pay for his food for chalamayid, that's called like a tzarech hamayid also, and it'll be mutter. So by me, Rav Nachman, schar pe'ula she'ein lo ma'yochel mahu. Same halacha. Amar le, he says we learned it in our Brayso Tanina. It says in our Mishnah, tzarech hamaycher she'ein lo ma'yochel. It says in the Mishnah that you could do it for a tzarech hamaycher, but he doesn't have anything to eat. Why did I need to really say she'ein lo ma'yochel? Just simply saying oil tzarech hamaycher, that would have been enough, because that would tell me what does it mean tzarech hamaycher. Obviously, for him, he needs money because he doesn't have enough money. Why are you saying she'ein lo ma'yochel? That's extra. That little extra part of the Brayso, sorry, part of the Mishnah, should be then taught to teach me this halacha. Lasuyei, what's it coming to teach me? Lav lasuyei schar pe'ula, isn't it coming to teach me to extend the din not only by a meicher but even by a worker? No, you can't bring me a raya, because maybe all the Mishnah means to say by that is perushik mefarish, is an explanation of what's going on, but not a new halacha. Abai is asking a kasha here, but really what he means to say is maybe I can bring you a raya from the Mishnah on Daf Yud Ches, where it talks about Shtari Chov. A Shtar Chov is a contract, it's a loan document. So it says over there that Ein Kos and Shtari Chov b'Moed, you're not allowed to write a loan document on Chalamayid. Now the reason why you're not allowed to write a document is because Ksiva is Aser on Chalamayid, it's a malacha. However, if I don't trust the person who I'm lending the money to, then I'm allowed to write it. Oh, or if the person doesn't have anything to eat, then I'm allowed to write it. So what's it referring to? Meaning, I understand that if I don't trust the borrower, I can write a shtar because I don't trust him that it's going to be considered a loan, a chov that's a milva al pet. I want to have it a milva b'ksat. I want it to be written in a shtar so that if I need to come to the best, then I can say, look, he owes me money. But if I trust him, why am I allowed to write it just because he doesn't have anything to eat? So Elamai, it must be, is it not coming mai, lav schar? Isn't it obviously referring to the person who is writing the shtar itself, who he might be someone who needs the money, and therefore we're hiring him to write the shtar because this is a way for us to get him the money that he needs. So therefore we're allowed to have the shtar written. Meaning from this brisa, you could prove the answer to the question that Rav asked Rav Nachman about schar pula, that if I'm hiring someone to do work for me, and he's someone who's a socher, he's a poil, she'ein lo mayochel, he doesn't have enough to eat, Allah is going to be that I'm allowed to hire. Continues the Gemara, Moshe Rav Sheish says the kasha. The Mishnah says in Psachim. Mishnah Psachim is following, is talking about the sugya of the Isser Malach on Erev Pesach. The Isser Malach on Erev Pesach is a minig. It's a mokum shenagu that they were knowing Isser Malach Erev Pesach before Chatzos. So they had a place where you're not allowed to do malach. So Chum said the following halacha: Shalosh umnius, the following three professions, whereas normally there's an isser malacha, isser malacha b'arvei psachim at chatzos. They can even do malacha before chatzos. Chayotin, tailors, sparin, barbers, kovsin, and launderers, people who do laundry, like a dry cleaning. Now, why are those three us? Or chayotin, shekena head yitay for kedarka b'chalosh hamayid. Tailors allowed because why? Because even a regular person is allowed to sew on Chalamayid. So you see that there's a way for tailoring to be mutter on Chalamayid, and if it's mutter on Chalamayid, kol shekain, that it's going to be mutter Erev Pesach, which is a lighter level of Isser Malacha. Hasparin, Hakovsin, barbers and launderers, Shechina Bayim Medina Sayam, a person who comes from outside the city of Ayotim Beis Hasur, and a person comes out of prison, Mutar and Lasaprid, allowed to get a haircut, Chabas, and get his clothes clean, B'chalosh Hamayit. So you see that if they're mutar Chalamayid, kol shekain, they should be mutter Erev Pesach, even for a professional. So what do you see from this din? You see from this case that the Chachamim are saying that the din of Erev Pesach and the din of Chalamayid are linked. That if it's mutter on Chalamayid, then kol shekain will be mutter Erev Pesach. So what's the question? If you're going to tell me that a person I can hire to do work for me as long as it doesn't have anything to eat is mutter, then that means effectively I can hire him to do whatever I want. So then why do the Chachamim limit it to these three dinim? Kol malachus nami lishtaru. Everything should be mutter. Right? So Gemara says, what do you mean? You're trying to derive from the din of Erev Pesach and Chalamayid that they're connected. If that's the case, I'll find you a couple of other things. I should be allowed to build, construct things Erev Pesach. Why? Because I'll tell you, there are scenarios that I can find that it's mutter to build on Chalamayid. What's the case? What if I have a wall that's like looks like it's going to fall and it's hanging out into Rosh Hashanah? So Rabbanu, we learned this earlier. I'm allowed to knock it down and rebuild it, Kedarka, without any shinuyim to prevent people from getting injured. So what do you see? There's a way for it to be mutter on Chalamayid. So if that's the case, then so to Erev Pesach it should be mutter according to your logic, and it's not. Maskef Ravina, similar type of question. We know that a sofer is normally not allowed to do malacha on Erev Pesach, and he's not allowed to do malacha on Chalamayid. However, if he's doing it for kiddushay nashim, for like the shtar erisin, or for gittin to write a get, or b'shayvin for receipts, or for various different scenarios where you need to, keep track of what was bought or sold, it's mutter because maybe it's a davar of different reasons. But the point is, you have a heter to do it on Chalamayid, and if that's the case, then you should be allowed to do it even Erev Pesach according to your logic, and we know you're not. So again, the point in these two questions is just to make the obvious question clear that the fact that something is mutter on Chalamayid under certain circumstances has nothing to do with Erev Pesach, meaning the two have nothing to do with each other. Elamar Vashi, Mayid Arbas or Karamis, you're trying to compare the Isser Malacha by Chalamayid to the Isser Malacha on Erev Pesach. That there's no connection. Mayed, the reason why in Chalamayid there's an Isser Malacha mishum tircha, because whenever there's an Isser Malacha that has tircha, it's aser. It's just that what b'mkayim seidish rabbanon, that whenever you have a hefset, you're allowed to do it. V'chein, other scenarios, whether it's a sakana or it's a tzarech hamayid or whatever it is, there are times when the rabbis are going to allow you to do it. But that's a unique din in Chalamayid. Arba asar. The reason why there's an Isser Malacha on Arba asar is mishum tzarech yontif, is because if it's not a tzarech yontif, it's aser. They were makabel upon themselves to do an Isser Malacha as a kavod yantiv, but obviously those things that are a tzarech yantiv are going to be mutter. meaning it has nothing to do with what is and isn't Asur and Mutter on Chalamayid. So therefore, immediately the Tzarech Yontif Shara Rabbanon, those things that are Tzarech Yontiv, the rabbi said is Mutter. So, for instance, a tailor, a barber, a launderer, those things are obviously the Tzarech Yontif. People need their clean clothes, they need their clothes to fit, they need to look menschlich on Yontif. So therefore, those things are going to be Mutter ever Pesach even before Chatzais. Midi the lav Tzarech Yontif, whereas if it's not something that's the Tzarech Yontif, Lo Shara Rabbanon. Meaning the Gemara means to say that when the Chachamim specifically said those three things are Mutter, because they're mutter in some fashion on Chalamayid, was just using the heter on Chalamayid to show you that just like on Chalamayid it's mutter because it's a tzarech hamayid in certain circumstances, so too Erev Pesach it's going to be mutter because it's a tzarech hamayid, but not just simply because on Chalamayid it's mutter. I can therefore extrapolate to all scenarios where it's mutter. So therefore there's no kasha on the poel who is ein lemayochel. The fact that we'll hold that he is allowed to, I'm allowed to hire him to work for me in order to get him paid. That's not going to mean that every single malach is going to be mutter of Pesach, because it has nothing to do with tzorech yontiv. New Mishnah, you're not allowed to take kalim from my house to another house, and we'll see in the Gemara, this is talking about where I'm going through Rosh Hashanah, where it's befarhesia. I'm allowed to go from my house to the chutzner, and we'll see over in the Gemara in the Maskara that it's only talking about where it's shelo befarhesia, b'tzina. But Enochanami, if it's befarhesia, there's no difference between a bias and a chutzner. The Gemara and its havamina is going to assume that we're talking in both of these cases with befarhesia, and it's going to ask a stira from Reish to Seifa. But as I just explained, that's what the Gemara is going to answer. And as well, ein mevi and kelim beis ha'omen, you're not allowed to pick up your, let's say, you had a suit tailored by a tailor. You're not allowed to pick that suit up on Chalamayid as long as if the suit is not for Chalamayid, like the business suit, you're going to be needing it next week. You're not allowed to pick that up on on Chalamayid, because it's a tircha shelo l'tzorech, it's going to be aser. However, if you're concerned that maybe it's going to be stolen or something's going to happen to it, then the halach is you're allowed to take it from him. However, mifanan lechatzor acheres, you keep it in that chatzor, don't bring it out for hesia in public. This entire mission, of course, is only talking about when there's no tzorech hamoed. The way I explained it was that you're not allowed to pick it up when the suit is not a suit for yontif. But obviously, if I need the suit for Chalamayid, or if I need the thing I'm picking up or moving from one house to another, even before Hesi, it's going to be mutter if it's l'tzarech hamayid. This entire mission is only when it's not l'tzarech hamayid. Ask the Gemara of a habris reisha aim to find the klal, like I explained in the Mishnah. It said in the Mishnah that you can't go from your bias to bias, but you can go from bias to chutzner. What's the difference? Meaning, if it's before Hesia, they should both be usher. If it's b'tzina, they should both be mutter. Habris reisha aim to find the klal, and yet you're saying here you can put it into a chutzner, even though it's bershus harabim. Rabbi Yenachanami seifa us on the bias shabachutzer. It's talking about where you're going from the bias to the chutzner inside the chutzner. Meaning it's not going through Rishus Harabim, but there's no difference between a bias and a chutzner. Bias to bias is, and bias to chutzner is mutter if it's b'tzina, and bias to bias and bias to chutzner is going to be also if it's Rishus Harabim, and therefore that's how you explain the stira in the ratio to the sefer. The Mishnah said, "Ein mevi and kelim beis ha'omen." However, if you're choshesh that there's going to be stolen, you're allowed to move them, right? Amar Papa. Papa said the following statement. Badikl and Rava wanted to test us to make sure we understood what's going on. From the following stira, it says in our Mishnah, maybe in Kalim based on, you're not allowed to move Kalim from the Umin. You're not allowed to pick up your tailored suit from the tailor on Chalamayid. And you are allowed to drop off and pick up your tailored suit from the tailor on Chalamayid, even when it's not L'tzarech Hamayid. So it's a blatant stira of one Mishnah to a Brisa, or actually this is another Mishnah in Psachim. Right? So the Gemara said, and so that's what he was asking us, this obvious question, very obvious blatant stira, and we answered, don't bring me a raya from the Mishnah Psachim, like we explained before. That Mishnah Psachim is talking about Erev Pesach. Kan ba'arba over there, the Mishnah Psachim is talking about Erev Pesach before Chatzos, there's an Isur Malacha, and what it's saying over there is with regard to that Isur Malacha, it's going to be mutter, kan b'chol shel, whereas by us, it's going to be usr, because it's talking about Chalamayid, meaning because there's two separate Isurim. By Chol Shel Mayed, by Chalamayid, the Isur is entirely about Tircha. This is a Tircha Shelo L'tzarech, it's going to be Usr. There is no Isur Tircha Erev Pesach, so even though it's not L'tzarech Hamayid, it's going to be Mutter, because there's no Isur Tircha Erev Pesach. Mashe'en Kain, by Chalamayid, it's an Isur Tircha. Iba is a second teretz to explain the Chiluk, that La'ilam Ema, Hava Hava Chol Shel Mayed, they're both talking about Chalamayid, meaning they both have an Isur Tircha. Why the Mishnah Psachim did it say that it's Mutter for me to go ahead and pick up my suit from the tailor? Why am I allowed to pick the item up from the base element? Kan b'maminai, when do we say that it's mutter? That's when I trust him. All the way around. When is it usher? When it's mamina? When I trust him. When I trust him, therefore I'm not nervous it's going to go anywhere. I have to leave it. I have no heter to do it. Tircha shelo l'tzarech. Kan b'she'ena mamina. When am I allowed to move it? That is only when I don't trust him. Therefore I'm allowed to move it from his place of business into a more secure place. That is the explanation of the Gemara. And this second answer, that there's a chiluk between Maminoi and Eina Maminoi, is also taught in the Brayso about Tanya B'nichusa. Maybe in Kelu Beis Omen, I'm allowed to bring something from the Beis Omen. Again, we'll stick with our tailor situation. I could bring my suit that I had tailored by the tailor, or the Gemara gives it in its own case, the Brayso going Kadmi Beis HaKadar, a jug from the house of the jug makers, the Kosmi Beis HaZagag, or you're talking about like a glass or a cup from the glass maker, the glass blower, meaning though both of these scenarios, the jug and the glass, are things that I'm going to be needing with tzarech hamayitz, therefore they're mutter. I'm allowed to do it even though it's a tircha, because it's a tircha l'tzarech. I'm not allowed to bring wool from like the house of the person who dyes it, from the business from who dyes it, and also I'm not allowed to bring utensils from the professional's house. In this case, I'm not allowed to bring a suit from the Beis HaUmin. In this case, it's shalol l'tzarech, right? However, if the person who is the professional who I'm going to, whether it's the umin or it's the person who's dyeing my wool, then the halacha is I can pay him, but I still have to leave the item because I'm not allowed to pick this item up. It's aser. However, if I don't trust him, or if I don't trust the situation, then I'm allowed to take it from him and put it into a house that's nearby. If I'm nervous that it's going to be stolen from there, I can put it in a different chutzner. And if that chutzner is a problem, if I don't trust the owner of that chutzner, then but you see from over here, from this brisa, a raya to the answer that we said before, that you can even put both brises together by saying they're both by cholamayid, and one's where I trust him, therefore it's also for me to take it out because I don't have to be nervous about Gzela. When am I allowed to take it out? That's when I don't trust him, and therefore I'm allowed to move it. Gemara says, okay, that works very nicely. You've explained picking the item up from the tailor, but how am I allowed to drop it off? It said in the Mishnah Pesachim that not only am I allowed to pick it up, I'm allowed to drop it off. Meaning what? Melichin, Taratz the Mivian, Melichin Kasha, right? Because our Mishnah, which says a Mivian, it's a Mivian, Vekol Shekain Ein Melichin. Of course, you're not allowed to drop it off. The whole potential heter would have been to pick it up, but certainly to drop it off, that's not going to be L'tzarech Yom Tov at all. That's for Zichar Aser. So therefore, clearly that's going to be a problem. And your only answer is that you're allowed to pick it up because you're nervous that by leaving by him, someone's going to steal it. But that does not give you a heter to drop it off. Ella, you're right. The second teretz of being mechalik between cholamayid and cholamayid, when one's talking about where you're nervous it's going to be stolen, and one's talking about where you're not nervous it's going to be stolen, where you trust him or don't trust him, is not a good teretz for dropping off the item, only for picking up the item. Ella mechavarta kedushin mikara will go with the first teretz and say that our Mishnah is talking about cholamayid and is mutter. Why? Because is also because it's a tircha shalol tzarech. Mashenkin, the other Mishnah, the Mishnah Pesachim, is talking about our Pesach, where there is no iser tircha, so therefore not only are you allowed to pick it up, you're even allowed to drop it off. New Mishnah, mechapen is aktziyos bekash. You're allowed to cover, like figs that were drying, they were spread out to dry. You're allowed to cover them with straw to protect them from like the rain and from the whatever it can get on it, all the schmutz that's outside. Review the Eimer, he says not only can you cover it, you can even be ma'abin it, which it's not clear exactly what that means. The Gemara is going to define the difference between mechapen and ma'abin. It seems that mechapen is a lower form of protection, and ma'abin is a stronger form. And the chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda is even though there's a tircha in making it even that much more protected, it's going to be mutter. Moichrei Paris, a person who sells fruit, ksus, clothing, v'kelim, and vessels, utensils. Moichrei b'tzina l'torach hamod, you're allowed to sell it. You can't do it for hesia, but you can do it b'tzina, and of course you can only sell it if it is l'torach hamayid. And I would assume over here the halach is the same, that if the person is an ein mayochal, then it would be the same over here also, even shalol l'torach. But it didn't need to say it because it was already touched on before. Hatzayodin, trappers or fishermen, and anyone who like crushes like grains, the hagroisais, or they crush beans. These basically are various different types of professionals. They're doing the type of malacha that, because the way they do it makes a lot of stuff, meaning it looks like they may be doing it even for after Yontiv, therefore it needs to be done so people shouldn't conclude you're allowed to do malacha on chalamayid for even after chalamayid. Rabbi Yosi says, Heim hechmiru al atzman, meaning these sayodim and the shoishes and groisais, they were machmir on themselves, which is not clear if Rabbi Yosi is saying that the statement of the Tanakama is too makel and he's coming to be machmir even beyond that, or does he mean to say that the din of the Tanakama itself is a chumrah, and really meikar din it's more makel? So there's a shaila whether Rabbi Yosef is being machmir or makel. We'll see it in the Gemara. But either way, what did it say in the Mishnah? It said you can cover figs to prevent them from getting ruined. Rabbi Yehuda said you can even cover them in a more strong fashion. They argued in the name of Chizkin Rabbi Yochanan about exactly what it means in the Mishnah when we say ma'aben and mechapen. Chad Amr mechapen is a kloishe. It means that you're covering it in sort of a weaker way where you're leaving them space in between the straw. And ma'aben is a smeichi where you're pushing them and you're condensing them all together. Meaning to say that the Tanakama holds you can only do it with a level of tircha that's going to keep them separate, whereas Rabbi Yehuda is including even doing it in a condensed fashion, which is a little bit of a more malacha, and therefore it's more tircha, and he's being more makel. The Chad Amar, whereas the other shita holds, mechapen bein akloishi bein asmeichi, that covering it means even if you're going to condense it, and ma'aben Rabbi Yehuda was adding on that you can be oisa kimin kri, you can even pile it up together in a way that's a tremendous amount of tircha and cover it that way, and it's going to be mutter. Tanya nami hachi ma'aben oisa kimin kri, that you can cover it. It means you can put it up in a pile, and it's going to be mutter divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Continues the Gemara. It said in the Mishnah, Meichrei Peiros Ksus v'Kelim Meichrei Mitzina. They can be sold Mitzina, but they cannot be sold b'Farhesia, and it has to only be l'tzarech hamayit. Ask the Gemara. Ibaylahu, I have a kasha. Hey nechmir al atzman. When it said Rabbi Yossi said there have that those three types of umnin, they were machmir on themselves. What did he mean? Did he mean the lehavi avdi klal, that the chachamim were saying that they went ahead and were allowed to do their malacha, that it's betzina, and he was coming to be machmir and say that they can't even do it at all, meaning he's being machmir? Like Dilma, no, he's being makel. The avdi betzina, meaning this that the chachamim said that they did it betzina, that in and of itself was a chumrah, but really meikar din it could have even been done farhesia. Which is it? Is he being makel or is he being machmir? Tashma, I'll bring you from a brisa, a long brisa, but the brisa is effectively going to be saying that he was being machmir, that the chachamim were saying they could do it betzina, and he was coming to say that they can't do it at all. Tashma, meichrei peiros ksus v'kelim, meichrei betzina l'tzarech hamayid. They're allowed to be sold privately, discreetly, but only l'tzarech hamayid. Rabbi Yossi Omer, no. Tagari Tiveria, the vendors in Tiveria, hey nechmiru al atzman, they were machmir, shelo yehu meichrei kol ikar, they didn't sell it at all. If you have a person who traps animals and birds and fish, you can do the trapping discreetly. The Tzarech HaMoed, that's the Tanakama, Rabbi Yossi Omer, the trappers of Akai, al Atzman, they were machmir shelo yehu tzadin kol ikar, they wouldn't do it at all. Again, you see that he was machmir. And the third case is our case, the Shayshe Chilka Targis V'Tisni, which is basically these types of grains, which could be made into chilka. It can be made into targis. It can be made into tisni. We'll see what those are in a second. The halacha is that the pounding of that of those grains, daishin betzina l'tzarech hamayid, are allowed to be done discreetly on Chalamayid, whereas Rabbi Yossi Omer D'Shaishi Tzipayri Hein Chmir Al Atzman, the grain pounders of Tzipayri were machmir on themselves not to do it. Shelo Yehu Doishin Kol Likur. So you see again from over here, Rabbi Yossi was machmir, not makel. Amar Abaye, once we're bringing up this chilka, what exactly is chilka? So he says chilka means that chadal l'tarti is where you take one grain and you turn it by cracking it into two. And a targis is where you crack one kernel into three. And the third one, which is tisni, is chadal arba, where you take it and you turn it into four. It's basically different ways of grinding up and pulverizing this grain. Kiyasa Rivdimi, he said no. He says it's kunta, kunasa, whatever. That's referring to different shitas over here, but the understanding that I have is that it's spelt, meaning that it's a normal, regular grain. It's not wheat, but it's grain of spelt. So depending upon which sheet you go with, Abaye understands that chilka is a pulverized grain, and Rav Dimi understands it's not. It's rather a fully intact grain of spelt. So Gemara wants to ask a kasha here. Meisvei, I have a brisa. So the brisa says the following: chilka, targis, vitisni. These three things we just saw in the earlier statement. Timei and bechol makom. What's discussing over here? We're talking about the halach in hilchos machshirin. Normally, when something is makabel tumah, in order for it to be makabel tumah, it has to first be prepared to be makabel tumah. And the way it's prepared to be makabel tumah is only when it becomes wet with one of the 7 liquids that make something tummy. And therefore, until it gets wet, and until you can assume that it's wet, you don't necessarily can't assume that it's always going to be tummy. Now, why is that relevant here? Because chilka targis v'tisni, it says over here that tmei and bechol makom, meaning not only in the city but even in the village. The difference between the city and the village is that when it comes to making flour, the people, the refined people in the city, would only want their flour to be super clean. So therefore, they would make sure to soak the grains beforehand to get off any extra dirt or whatever it is, and therefore only afterwards would they turn it into flour. Whereas the people in the village were not so makbid, so they wouldn't soak it. So since that's the case, you might think that there's a distinction between whether the flour is makabel tuma or not later, right? Because if it's from the city, those in the city would soak it, and those in the village would not, except for it didn't touch water. But since targis, fitistivits, and chilka are all required to be soaked before they are smashed, then they're all tmein. And the Mishnah here, this Brisa is saying that tmein b'chol makom, not Brisa. It's a Mishnah in Machshirin. They're tmein b'chol makom. So again, what we're saying is that these three items were soaked in water, and that's the point, and therefore they're tamei. So Bishlam Lamanda Amr Chadal Tarti Latasla Arba Bishlam, according to Abaye, who told us that what is chilka? Chilka is where you pulverize it from one grain into multiple grains. That makes sense because what Mishum Hachi Tamein B'chol Mokim De Is Chashur, because they were soaked. Because you cannot break it down into these smaller pieces, pulverize them until they are soaked. Therefore, it makes sense to say that they're soaked. El Lamanda Amr Kunta, according to the Shita of Rabdimi, who holds that chilka is referring to a grain that has not been pulverized. The other two are pulverized, but this one has not been pulverized. Therefore, this kunta, who says it's ever been washed, and therefore who says that it should be makabel tuma? Haloi is chashur. It had never come in contact with water. So since it never came into contact with water, it never became prepared for tuma. If it never became prepared for tuma, why is it being included? So you see, it's a shtickle raya to the shita of Abaye. So he answers no. The Gemara says like this: the brisa that's talking about where it's going to become tamei is talking about the mikalpan, where they were the surrounding sort of like the shell of the grain was taken off. Meaning, and since the ilav the shar a little bit maya, had you not exposed it to water, had you not soaked it in water, then it would not, like having the kalpa, the shell would not come off. Therefore, it's also going to be tamei, even though it's a spelt grain like Redimi, and it's not a kasha. Ask the Gemara, I understand according to Abaye why it's called chilka. It's called chilka because, according to Abaye, you're pulverizing it from 1 to 2, and after you do that, you're left with a very smooth thing. But according to Redimi, who says that it's a spelt item, why would that be called smooth? That doesn't make sense. It's a round, bumpy grain. He says, no, it's the shakech chilkayu because the shell is called a chilka. It's like a chilka is removed, so therefore it's called chilka. Meisvei Brisa says the following: a person makes a neder that he's not going to have any hana from any type of grain, and we know that generally speaking, the darim are usually understood to be dependent upon the way people speak. So even if someone says something that's technically inaccurate, but if the general populace speaks that way and they include something as grain, even if it's not grain, it'll also be included in the nether. So Hanoider bin Adam and Asr after Pola Mitzri Yavesh, he's Asr for him to have any like of these dried Egyptian there are these beans that if they're dried out and you pulverize them, it looks like it's like a grain. So that's considered a grain, even though technically we would call it kidneys. However, it's mutter balach if it's a fresh, wet type of bean where it's not going to be pulverized into a powder. That doesn't look like a grain. People don't refer to that as grain. That's mutter. Mutter ba'oiris. Not only that, this brisa holds that rice is considered a non-grain. Bechilka, it's mutter bechilka, betargis fetisti. So you see over here, we mentioned chilka alongside these things. Now here is a major kasha. Like Abaye, who says that what you're doing is you're taking the grain of wheat and you're pulverizing it into multiple little things. You're almost like grinding it down. You could say now, Shapir, this is not called any longer grain because now it's already been pulverized into something else. The nafkilahu mitayras dagon, it's no longer considered grain. According to Redimi, who says that it's referring to a grain of spelt. Dagan malihu, this is a very normal category of grain. It's a completely normal category of grain. You have spelt, you have raw, you have wheat, barley, whatever it is. Spelt is one of them. So this is taka kasha. The Gemara says kasha, and otherwise we don't have an answer. Rav Huna shar lahu lahanu krupaisa. Rav Huna was allowing the krupaisa. What are krupaisa? Krupaisa are like they sell spices. They go from different place to place. And they sell spices. Not only that, it was mutter lemezel lezabaynik or chayu b'shuki. He allowed them to sell it in like a public fashion, meaning bifar hesia. He allowed them to do it bifar hesia. Now, This was a problem. Aser Rav Kahana, Chanus Psuchel Stav. Rav Kahana is asking a kasha from a brisa where it says that if you have a store that opens up to this area that is a stav. A stav is basically like, it's sort of like, best way to say a stav is like, it's a you have like little pillars in the street in front of the stores, right? So I guess that would probably be the best way to describe it. So it says over here that chanus psuchel stav, if it opens up to these pillars, paiseach v'noyel kedarkoi, the brisa says that you're allowed to open and close your store in the normal manner on chalamayid, because by having the pillars there, it like makes it betzina, right? That's sort of the understanding. But if it's not opening up to a stav, but it's opened up to the Rishus Rabbin, then it's paiseach achas v'noyel achas. He has to open up one side but close the other side. He can't leave it mamish open all the time because it's b'ferhesia and it's aser. And yet you, Rav Huna, said it's mutter. The Erev Yontiv. What if it's Erev Yontiv? Ha'achron shel Chag. We're talking about Erev Shmini Atzeres. Moitzi u'ma'at reshuki ha'ir b'peiros. You can go ahead and take the fruit from the stores and you can push it out into the city, onto the front over there, to honor the Yontiv of Shmini Atzeres. So what do you see? You see you're allowed to go ahead and put your stuff out for sale only as a kavod Yontiv. Mibnei kavod Yontiv ha'achron in. Shaloi mibnei kavod Yontiv loi. You see, not b'mnei kavod yontiv, it's going to be usher. So how can you want to tell these spice merchants to go ahead and do that? How are you allowing them to do that, even though it's b'ferhesia? That should l'chayr be usher. Like Kasha, he says, ha b'peiri, ha b'tavlin. One is talking about where it's b'peiri, meaning what? When peiros are bought in volume, right? Not shver. So the brisa that says that it's usher to sell in the normal manner, that it's usher to sell b'ferhesia. That's referring to when you're selling fruit. When you're selling fruit, it's usually bought in large volume, and therefore it could have been purchased before Yontiv, and therefore people are going to be chayshish that maybe you bought it for even after the Yontiv. So if someone goes on Chalamayid and buys from the fruit, people are going to be nervous. We're nervous that people might conclude that you're allowed to buy stuff on Chalamayid for even afterwards. Masha'ain kain tavlin, spices, those are not bought in tremendous volume. Therefore, no one's going to incorrectly conclude if they see them buying it. But for Hesia, that they're buying it tzarech after Yontiv, they'll only think that it's a tzarech hamayid, and therefore it's going to be mutter. Hadron Allah mishahapach. This is the end of the second parak. Mitzvah tomorrow we'll pick up from here and learn the new Mishnah and the new parak of Elam Megalchim, discussing all of the halachas of Avelos. Shkoyach.